Hello and welcome. Today we are going to be talking about speciation. Now, I've given you assignments where you've gone over how the principle of natural selection turned into the theory of natural selection proposed first by Darwin and Wallace. And then last week I gave you information for you to do assignments on evidence of evolution. Today we're going to be talking about speciation. So as I go through these notes today with you, please use your bill to take your notes based upon these slides so that you can use that for the project that you're going to be completing, and so that you can do the assignment that I also have in Schoology for you. And you'll need the information presented here accessible to you. So it doesn't matter what page you put it on, just that next page that you have in your bill. So let's go ahead and get started. So if we think about speciation, it has this root word of species in it. So in order for you to define what a species is, there's lots of different ways that you could define that. But since this is biology, the biological definition of a species consists of this. It says that it is a group of similar organisms that can be bred and produce fertile offspring. So if two species could mate and not just make offspring, but can make offspring that can make offspring, then that is considered a species. Other definitions could be like morphological, so you would just use the actual traits that they have, and if they are similar in structure, then they could be grouped together as a species. And that might be more reliable for something like a dinosaur. We cannot see if two dinosaurs would mate together, since Jurassic Park is not real yet. So in this case, we can just use some other definitions of a species. But for right now, we're going to say that a species are two organisms that can mate together to make offspring that are fertile, or that could make their own offspring. If we think about the entirety then of life, here's just a few beetle samples, and you can see how they are very different in terms of their traits from one another. So really, we want that definition then to be able to distinguish one species from another. One example that is in your book that talks about squirrels. Now, right now, if you look outside of your window, you might be able to see the common eastern gray squirrel. But there are squirrels. There are two squirrels here that your book mentions. One is called the kaibab squirrel, and the other is the Albert squirrel. Now, these two squirrels, you don't find them here, but you do find them in the Grand Canyon. And they are on opposite sides of the Grand Canyon. Now, I have never been to the Grand Canyon. Maybe you have. I hope to get there someday. But I envision if I were to go there, I would be just awed by the size of the Grand Canyon. So think about two different squirrels on either side of the Grand Canyon. It's probably not feasible that these two squirrels are going to be able to interact with one another. So if we use them as an example to define if they are two species, we can look at their traits and we can see that they do have very similar traits to one another, but they don't have all of those same characteristics. So some of the differences that you might be able to see just might be in coloration. The kaibab has more of this red patch on its back. The Albert squirrel is going to have a more white belly. So these squirrels are closely related, but they do have different characteristics. And because they are separated physically, they are not going to be able to mate with one another. And even if they were together, they probably still would not be able to mate with one another. So therefore, we can note that they are going to be two separate species. And they became separate species probably because of that separation. If we think of the Grand Canyon, remember that Darwin was really influenced by Lyell's work in geography, that not only are the processes that are shaping Earth still going on today, but that they take a really long time. So if these two squirrels were separated for a really long period of time, then that can make them two separate species because they're not going to be able to mate with one another and produce fertile offspring. So this process of one species becoming two is called speciation. Speciation is the rise of two or more species from a single existing species. So if I'm looking here at my fruit fly example, if I have this original population, and again, there is going to be some variation amongst individuals. And also remember that natural selection cannot happen without that heritable variation. So let's say that there are two new food sources into this environment. That might mean that these individuals that have this preference for starch and these individuals that have this preference for maltose are going to become two separate species. If they're going to spend more time around starch and this one around maltose, then what will happen is these species are going to be separated, and therefore they're going to be reproductively separated since they're not going to be in the same vicinity or area. And over time, that is going to build two separate species. Mutations will slowly accumulate, so even if these two species were to come into contact with one another, they might have different mating preferences, they might have different times at which they are mating, and therefore they are going to develop into two separate species. So speciation, the rise of two or more species from that single existing species. The requirements, what has to happen in order for speciation to happen? First thing, species need to acquire mutations that lead to different adaptations due to natural selection. So you have to have variation in the environment. Of that variation, you need to have certain adaptations. And remember, an adaptation is going to be a trait that gives you an advantage in your environment. So they might have slightly different adaptations, and that is going to be increasing the fitness or its ability to not only just survive, but reproduce and pass on its trait to the next generation. And if that mutation is continued to pass on, then you can build up even more of these changes over time, and that's going to lead to that speciation event. So first, you need to have this natural variation within that population. Second, the species then need to be in reproductive isolation. So there has to be some type of barrier in the way that's going to cause these two species to not be able to reproduce. Now, there are lots of different types of reproductive isolation. In this example here with the beetles, you have this physical reproductive isolation. So this is called a geological reproductive isolation, where there is a physical barrier. There's a stream in the middle. So these two populations of beetles are not going to be able to interbreed and continue to pass on those mutations in that gene pool or that population. And then over time, you're going to, again, build up those mutations, build up those differences, different adaptations, and that if they were to get put back into the same environment, reproductive isolation still holds, where they're not going to be able to mate because they are so different, that they cannot mate to produce viable, fertile offspring. So there are two different types. I talked about geographic isolation here. This one just has two foxes, again, separated by some type of physical barrier. So the last example was a river. This example, again, a river. It says, if you really loved me, you'd swim across. And he's making the choice to not do that. So therefore, they are reproductively isolated. So what is it? If you were to write a definition, you could say, when gene flow is interrupted between two populations of the same species. So that gene flow, it just means you're not passing those genes or alleles in both of those populations. Those genes stay over here, or these genes stay over here, and there is no gene flow or mixing. Another type of reproductive isolation would be temporal isolation. So think of time when you think of temporal. So in this case here, I have two flowers. This one says, Ted, wake up. It's time to release pollen. This one says, ugh, give me a few more months. So in this case, this is ready to mate, to reproduce, and this one is not. So therefore, they are not going to be mating together to produce fertile offspring. Other types then, physical separation, again, like I said, that's that geographical isolation. And then temporal, which I had on the other slide. Here's some other examples. So for physical separation, if we think of this Panama, Panama is going to be the separating divider between these two different seas, or the Gulf of Panama and the Caribbean Sea. And therefore, these crayfish are not going to be able to meet up and mate. So therefore, there's a physical separation and there's a reproductive isolation in place. Or the temporal, where you have different time events of their mating patterns. So if we think about maybe some sounds right now, you might have some toads, maybe frogs, starting their chorus for their mating song. But here we have the red-legged frog and the yellow-legged frog, and they're going to mate in different seasons, so spring versus fall. So they're not going to be mating together, and if they're at the same time, and if they're not mating at the same time, they cannot mate to create fertile offspring. Behavior is another isolating mechanism. So right now you're probably also hearing lots of bird calls. We actually have baby birds right out of the window that I'm filming here. So it's happening now. But even though these two meadowlarks look very similar to one another, here the eastern and your western meadowlark, their songs are just slightly different from one another, so they're not going to attract their mate. And if they don't attract their mate, they cannot mate to create fertile offspring. So mutations cause the variation of the population that does allow for speciation, but how does the trait change? So how would that happen? So now that we have our populations then that are going to be separated over time, there are a few different ways in which natural selection can actually act on those adaptations or mutations. One of those is called directional selection. So if I were to look at a trait, now these traits tend to be like these traits that are controlled by many genes, so a polygenetic trait. In this case here, this one is going to be tail length for this gecko, this lizard. If I have a population and if I were to plot out the tail length, then what I would see is that most of the population is probably going to have about an average tail length. You do have some that are really short and some that are really long. But if this is directional selection, then what would happen is nature would select for one of the extremes. So in this case here, it looks like it is selected for the long adaptation or long variation of that trait. So this example says, long wiggly tails look more like a snake and scare predators. The longer the tail, the more it looks like a snake. And that's going to give them the advantage in the environment. It increases their fitness so they can not only just survive, but also reproduce and pass on this long tail to their offspring. Another way that natural selection can act on those changes would be with stabilizing selection. So in this case here, if the, again, original population had this kind of normal bell curve, after stabilizing selection, you're going to have most of the individuals have this medium or average trait. So it selects for the moderate trait or the average trait, and it selects against both of the extremes. So the example here, it says, short tails mess up the cat's balance, but long tails drag on the ground. So the medium tail is the best. So stabilizing selects for that average or medium trait. And then disruptive selection, again, we have an original population here, but you can see that there is an increase in both of the extremes. So it selects for both extremes, and it selects against those moderate or medium traits. You can see that level, that fitness level went down. The example, short tails help to keep these predators from catching their tails. And then this one, maybe a squirrel, it says long tails are good for balance in the trees, and the medium tails don't give it any advantage. Therefore, nature selects against that medium trait. Another way that can shape these traits once there is that reproductive isolation and could result in speciation is something called coevolution. So when you have two or more species that are going to evolve in response to each other. So think of this like a predator-prey situation or a plant and pollinator situation. That in the example here, we have a garter snake and a newt. In this example, we are going to um, have our newt be really toxic and poisonous to the garter snake. So this garter snake is going to develop a resistance to this toxicity. And then since the newt is being eaten, it's going to try to develop an even stronger or potent toxic chemical. And you're going to see this kind of evolutionary arms race. Each one is going to get progressively more and more and more. Or if we think of a plant and a pollinator, there are very specific shapes that some of these pollinators have that they are going to be the only one that might be able to access like the nectar inside of this flower. So you can see this relationship, how one really does shape the other, and that even though it is nature choosing, it's this really symbiotic relationship that they both share to one another. Now, through these changes in speciation, it can also result from adaptive radiation. So speciation can happen in a relatively quick period of time through adaptive radiation. So this is speciation through the diversification of one ancestral species into many descendants. So this usually happens quickly as species benefit from less competition or new niches or specializations. So there might be maybe a predator that's been removed, and that can allow for adaptive radiation to occur, or just a competitor species that's being removed. New niches, so this is like a new job or role that opens up in the environment. So think of like when the dinosaurs became extinct. If they were no longer there playing a certain role in the environment, then maybe something like a really small mammal could have a big new wide variety of jobs that are opening up, and therefore you can have this quick speciation happening where those mammals, through that variation that they have, they can then quickly go through this process of speciation and become these new species, or just specialization. So there might be just a mutation in the population that will allow for them to better access some food source or better compete. So this example here is of the Galapagos finches that Darwin studied. It started from one ancestral finch species, and then because these were new islands, so if you think of the Galapagos Islands, they had not been around for very long, so there weren't other bird species that were occupying that area, that they could very quickly diversify into all of these different species. One point of emphasis, though, is that it's not during one lifetime that the species became a new species, but this is going to be even though it's going to be quick, it is going to be a gradual change over time, and that it has to happen in a population. One individual species cannot evolve, like one individual member of the species cannot evolve during its lifetime, but over time, those species, that population can change. And then I mentioned with the adaptive radiation that one event that might occur might be the extinction of another species. And that can also then account for these individuals being able to go through speciation through adaptive radiation. So extinction is the elimination of a species from Earth. So when we think about our mass extinctions that we have had on our planet, they say that there have been 5 mass extinctions, so 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and that we might be on the verge of a 6th for all of the not so great things that humans are doing to our environment. So this is in your textbook. It says what patterns or trends are shown in the first graph. So if I'm looking here at graph A, it says extinction rate of families per million years. So this is of the different animal families per million years, and this is of million years. So this is going to show you these really high extinction rates that have happened throughout our Earth's lifetime. And it says, what is the cause of these patterns? So lots of things could cause this. There could be a sudden change in the environment from something like an asteroid. There could also just be the fluctuations that happen. So think of, the ice age. Think about global warming, maybe, that could also cause these mass extinction events. Second question says, what patterns or trends are shown on the second graph? And this one then shows us, our human population, and the number of extinction events that are happening. If you can see, the trend does look like one influences the other, that humans are influencing the rate at which other organisms are going extinct. What could possibly be the cause of that? Carbon dioxide emissions, overforestation, overfishing, over killing of poaching of other organisms, habitat infringement, pollution, all of those could go hand in hand with it. And then number 3, is there a relationship between the two graphs? So like I was alluding to, there could be. So we could be on that rise then for another mass extinction event if our environment were to change compared to the status quo that it is right now. And that is it for today. So like I said, there is an assignment in Schoology that is due this week where you're going to be using this information about types of natural selection and speciation to answer questions. And then your last assignment for the year is where you are going to choose an animal. Tell me about its adaptations that it has right now. Tell me about the habitat that it lives, because the habitat is going to dictate the adaptations that it has, so it can be successful in its environment. And then you're going to change its habitat. So let's not have them go through an extinction event, but what kinds of adaptations might be selected for in that population, and then explain them to me. And then once you are done that mini evolution project, you are done for the year. So if I do not see you on our Zoom call, I wish you all the very best. I hope that you have something to look forward to this summer, and I hope that I can see you in the fall. So stop by my room and say hi. So again, it's been a pleasure to teach all of you, and I hope that you are staying safe and staying healthy and staying sane and having some fun, but making sure that we follow protocols so that we can get back to our normal school schedule soon. All right, take care, everybody.